Thank you for watching these videos and thank you for subscribing. This is the third in a series of 6 videos of distinction that detail the distinctions, the differences between a merely good knife and a fine knife. And I tried to break these down into understandable segments. I appreciate your subscription. I appreciate your comments. And by doing that, you can help me keep these going. And I really am grateful for that. The last video I did was, in video number 2, was about finish. First video was about fit. Second video was about finish. And in the finish characteristics, I didn't want to come off saying, oh, all good knives are mirror polish. No, that's not true at all. And I realized I spent a lot of time on the mirror finish and didn't talk about other finishes. And the finishes, for instance, for tactical knives is not a mirror finish. I barely ever get requests for a tactical knife that is mirror polished. Once in a while I do, but it's actually pretty rare. Most of the tactical knives, close quarters combat knives and rescue knives and counterterrorism knives, the clients request those to have a flat finish, and often a flat and blackened finish or a darkened finish, so that it doesn't telegraph their position with a bright shiny blade. And it's also it just fits the kit better. And they're not so afraid to use it or afraid to dirty it up, or they don't want to look ostentatious or showy, and that's normal. I just didn't want to come across on the last video leaving you with the idea that only mirror finishes are good. So there are many different kinds of finishes. In a future video, we'll probably go into the details of how those finishes are done, the advantages and disadvantages of each, and where they work in the knife making field and process. But this is all part of the subject of today's video, this distinction, which is the distinction of balance. Okay, balance is the most important distinction in a fine knife. It is something that all factories, all manufacturers, and a lot of knife makers are failing in their control of balance. I say failing. Gosh, that's probably too harsh a word. They're limited. It is balance. Bad balance is the source of many ugly knives, many unsaleable knives, many poor knives, and knives that give knife making a bad name. And I've seen this throughout my career. But the hard thing about this is it's very difficult to define. There are different aspects of balance. There is the balance of the knife that appears in a photograph. There's the balance of color. There's the balance of shape. There's the balance of the knife's accessories. There's a balance of the use of the knife, and we'll cover those. I'll try to cover them quickly so this video isn't too long, and then we can dive into that stuff later for more detail if that's the way we go with this. So it's not something you can just put your finger on and say this knife is balanced and this knife is not balanced. Now I've heard guys say over the years, decades, I've heard guys sometimes come up with the story, well, a knife has to balance like a fulcrum perfectly on the blade to bolster junction, or perfectly where the forefinger contacts the blade. So for instance, that would mean that this knife, its perfect balance point would be right here at the forefinger. Let me turn it this, let's see, can I turn it? I really can't turn it where you can see it without my big hands in the way. There we go. So like a fulcrum, it balances. That is one balance characteristic, and that balance characteristic alone has tremendous variability. And to point that out, I'm going to show you something. This is a scalpel. This is one of the designs for one of the most accurate precision knives to be used by the human hand. And if you would go to that balance characteristic, you would say, well, that's a ridiculous knife because it can't be balanced because the handle is so huge. In this case, this is an older scalpel. The handle is metal. And even the new ones that are plastic, they're still handle heavy. Why? Because you need a big handle to fit the human hand, but you have a tiny, small control blade. And the purpose of this is for high precision and accuracy. So any knife that you require high precision and accuracy in cutting, then we can follow this example and say, well, it's more comfortable to have a small blade that you can accurately control like a fine instrument than it is to have a big old honking blade that is heavy and it would have to balance the weight of the handle. So there are all kinds of attempts to make this golden ratio or whatever you think it is, but it's none of that. It's not, all of that is wives' tale. That's superstition. That's just malarkey that makers that people have had for centuries trying to define what is a good knife. And the reality of it is that all balance characteristics as far as weight balance and the center of balance of a knife depend on the knife. I'll give you another, for instance. Here's another scalpel. This one has even a bigger, more volume handle, and it too is very handle heavy. But again, it's made for a good size grip. The one thing we have standard is we have our hands, but even hands vary in size. That's why the custom knife experience is so good, because you can vary the size of the handle to meet your client's needs if he has unusual size or shaped hands. So this one is another scalpel that has a big handle and a tiny little blade, and you can get in there and do some tight little accurate work with it. Well, let's take that a step further. This is a boning knife. This was the Sanchez, my Sanchez pattern. Thank you, James Sanchez. He worked with me on the design of this. And it's a very popular knife for boning. It doesn't look like much of a boning knife in some people's mind, but in a lot of clients it is, because this is a knife that's thin and can get in and do a lot of work, and it can bone a pretty large a hunk of meat. So it can strip the meat from the bone, and its balance point, its fulcrum point, is probably back here, slightly right there. Where I'm shaking a little bit here. Right where the dangerous. Anyway, its balance point is about right here in the handle, behind the bolster, but behind where the forefinger is. So you would say, if you use a fulcrum idea, then you would say this knife is handle heavy. Well, it should be slightly handle heavy, because what you're doing is you're doing delicate work inside an animal, or if you're carving meat, or if you're working with. This is not made for chopping. This is not made for cutting up and cubing, and this is made as a boning knife, a small slicer boning knife, more control. So the more control you want to have in your blade, that generally speaking, the handle tends to be heavier. But that's not always the case, so don't take these as hard and fast rules. Here's a different knife. This is a butcher knife. This is a big barbecue knife, and it's my Corbeil Vast pattern that I've made and sold for a barbecue set before. It's a big knife. And its balance point is actually what you would consider if you were using that method. You would consider this a perfect balance. It's right here, maybe right here at the forefinger point. Let's see if I can do this without dropping this knife. It's actually a little bit behind it, just a hair. I mean, just a hair behind where the forefinger sits. So but the knife is large and solid, and it has a large solid handle. So the balance characteristics between the handle size and volume and the blade are critically important as well. And this knife is made for working with large cuts of meat and large vegetables and things like that. And so it can do maybe some light chopping and board work and stuff. Here's a melon knife. This is one where you can want to have a great degree of control and thinness in the blade and the design and all. And yet the handle balance is actually right at what they would call the perfect point, which is right where the forefinger sits when you hold the handle. And that's got an aventurine handle, a gemstone handle. And so, but this is made for control also, but it's a smaller size handle. So the balance between the handle and the blade looks good too. And that's an important factor, is the way it looks and feels in the hand. One more I'll do real quickly. This is a large chef's knife. This is a French chef's knife designed as a sabatier. This is my Concordia pattern. And it has a very large and blade heavy design. Why? Because you're going to do a lot of heavy blade board work with this knife. So you would say, oh, this knife doesn't have the right balance. Well, all that's silly. Take it one step further. What's the balance for a knife like this? I mean, where are you going to balance this knife? Obviously, it needs to be blade heavy because of what its use is. And then here's a skinning knife that has a heavier handle and more strength in the thickness which a lot of people don't talk about, the thickness of the steel and its ability to transfer that force into motion when you're doing work with it, when you're doing chores with it. These are all balance characteristics. So it takes years of practice for each individual maker to establish his own balance style. And that's part of style. And we'll talk about style in the future. But everyone's different. The main thing is that the maker communicates with the buyer, or has the client in mind, particularly if he's working with him in a custom way, to develop knives that are of a balance that the client wants and requests and needs. And that's part of the whole custom knife experience. Some makers make big, large, puffy blades and handles, large volume handles that are either plastic or hardwoods, big bulbous handles, and some people like that. I don't particularly like that style, but some people do. And then some build knives with blocky, chunky handles. I've seen a lot of Bowie knives. Bowie knives is a very common knife in America, and I've seen a lot of them with squarish handles, big squarish handles, like they didn't really take any time to finish them or shape them to the human hand, which we'll talk about that too in a future video. And then some people build weak and anemic little handles, you know, kind of like a scalpel but with a bigger blade, and then they do a lot of, you know, thin work and filigree, and that's a style, but is it in balance? Well, it's very subjective. You have to understand what you can see from the picture. You have to interpret in your mind, and that may be the case in some facets of this. I've heard knife makers and other people say, knife collectors and stuff say, well, that's the reason for a knife show. You can go there and you can pick up a knife and see what it feels like, because that's important. But in our modern times, we do a lot over the internet. We do a lot of with videos and photos and stuff, and you can get a pretty good feel for what a knife feels like just by looking at the pictures and reading the description. If you try to be I try to be very descriptive in my presentation of the knives and show the knife from all kinds of different angles photographically, and so that the client knows, has a general feel for what he's getting into. And most of the time, in fact, I think I can only think of one knife that has ever been returned because of balance. Every knife, the hundreds and hundreds, I guess thousands of knives that I've made over my career, I've only had one knife returned, and the wife bought it for her husband, and he thought the handle was a little smallish for him. One knife, and out of hundreds, thousands, many hundreds in gemstone. And so what is the balance characteristic? Well, it's very hard to define, and each client is different. A counterterrorism client is different from a SWAT client, a SWAT team member. A U.S. Air Force pararescueman is different than a Navy SEAL. Everybody's different. There aren't, even these generalizations are broad, and that's the nice thing about custom knife making is the client can actually have his own specifications met if it's something you do. The knife that has bad balance is easier to tell than the knife that has the best balance. In other words, you look at a knife picture and you say, oh, that's a good looking knife. It has a nice style, nice look to it. Looks balanced. It looks, the handle's about the right size and shape. The blade, I like the blade for its purpose. Of course, every knife has a different purpose. So that's pretty good. I wonder what it feels like. Okay, you take that perspective, and then the perspective of you look at a knife and you're like, oh my God, what is this atrocity? This is, the handle's all blocky and square, and the blade is kind of pointed at an angle, and it's offset from the handle. The center line is not lined up. It doesn't look like one flowing piece. It looks like an abrupt assembly of parts. What kind of a concept did the guy have that designed that and made that, and how out of balance is it? So you kind of know bad balance when you see it immediately, and good balance then you can also interpret. So the important thing is that it's what separates a novice from a professional, and it also is something that may take years to develop in a knife maker. It may take him years to develop, and a lot of knife makers copy. We're going to go into copying other makers' work and stuff, because I get that a lot. I have to deal a lot with that. And you see a knife you like, and you're like, I want to copy that. That guy's got something going on there. I like that design. I'm going to copy it. Okay, but maybe you can't quite get the balance right, because maybe the knife was designed for a gemstone handle and you're putting a wood handle on it, and it doesn't feel quite right, or doesn't have the right volume, doesn't have the right shape. And these are all little characteristics that they're subjective, they're hard to define, and they're different in every knife and different for every client. And that's the hard thing. It's like, how do you define it? How do you define good balance? And then balance doesn't just start and exist with the knife. Balance is, does the sheath work with the knife? Is the sheath part of the knife? Is it part of the function of the knife? Is it does it balance it in its style, in its, first off, its function, physically functioning in protecting the safety of the wearer. By the way, knives are not carried, they're worn. And so does the sheath work with the knife? Does the sheath match the knife in design idea? We're not talking just about color, but we're talking about the design idea for the knife overall. For instance, here's this skinning knife. This is a Kochab skinning knife with a petrified sycamore handle, and I've shown this one before. And here's the sheath that goes with it. Well, they're matching style. They're in the same kind of tonal range. Everything matches the balance of the knife sheath, the balance of the front and the back of the knife sheath. You'd be surprised to see how many makers do not finish the back of a sheath, which is also another discussion, another topic we'll do in the future. But does it all balance? Does the knife balance with the sheath? Does the sheath balance with the use of the knife? In other words, this knife is made to be worn on a belt, but what if you have a tactical knife? Tactical combat knife, counterterrorism knife. Does the sheath balance with the knife? This knife is incredibly durable. It's crazy strong and durable, and so is the sheath. The sheath is made of double thickness Kydex, twice as thick as everybody else uses, and then it's 1/8 inch thick, and then it has anodized aluminum, high strength, corrosion resistant aluminum alloy welts that it's built on. Why? Because you don't want this in the vigorous nature of combat knife use, of tactical knife use. You don't want this sheath to fold or bend or fail in any way, shape, or form. It also has a hybrid tension tab locking mechanism that keeps the knife locked into the sheath. So one and the other, all these things are a matter of balance. They balance with each other. The color scheme, of course, is very dark and non-reflective because this is a tactical knife that's made for counterterrorism or tactical use. Or you can see the finish on the blade, which goes back to the last video where I was talking about flat finishes or dark finishes. And it's solid, and it absolutely locks in. It has variable springs. You can change the spring tension on the tab lock. You can see more about these sheaths on my page on locking combat or locking tactical knife sheaths on the site, and we'll talk more about them. But the important thing is that they're in balance with each other. So is the entire kit. This particular knife has a kit of many, many, many components that are all in balance of the idea of the knife and the use of the knife, so it's a completely usable tool that the owner, the wearer, the user can trust his life to. And that's a serious aspect of this that professional knife users bring to the table. We as makers need to be able to listen to those guys, and they'll tell us what they need. They'll let us know. They'll say, oh, this point needs to be thicker. Can I get a little more weight here? If you're willing to listen to it, if you're a true custom maker, you're willing to work with your client to establish that sense of balance that he needs in his knife project. So chef's knives, hunting knives, collector's knives, these are all balance issues. Does the maker balance his style with a particular client? For instance, a client may come up to me and say, oh, I want a certain kind of knife, and he describes it to me. That's not something I make, man. There's other makers that'll satisfy your needs. You need to go find them. We're not going to achieve a balance because I have a particular group of styles that I make, and although they are extremely wide ranging, they may not be in the wheelhouse of the person who's requesting a knife project. To that point, currently I have over 500 different knife patterns on my website, and of all of those that are up there, you can go see them. It's my most visited page on the site. The reason is because there are so many different people, there are so many different ideas of what constitutes a good knife design and knife balance that I've had over the decades to become very variable. That's probably not the right word. Very adaptable to different styles that people request. So when you see the patterns, you'll see, oh my gosh, there's a lot of patterns. And it isn't just fixed blades. There's also folding knives and special purpose knives, and there's all kinds of stuff up there. And the reason is because everybody's different. But bad balance can be told immediately, or when the client receives his knife, he can tell right away, oh, this is bad balance. I don't want this knife this way. And it's up to the maker to put forward as much cooperation and information as he can to the client's needs to satisfy his needs of a good balanced knife, and then couple that with decades of practice of making well-balanced knives. And what happens is most people, when they see it, they may see the picture on the photographs on the web, they may purchase the knife, and they're still, I understand, they're not certain, there's always that little level of uncertainty. Then they get the knife and they put it in their hand and they say, this is a wonderful, wonderful tool and instrument. And that's what good balance can bring and why it's so important.